Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here talking about the British Empire in the age of imperialism. What we've been talking about to this point so far is that in the late 1800s, a new wave of imperialism, that is, European empires going and taking over other places, a new wave of imperialism starts to sweep across the globe as European empires scramble to take over as much of places like Africa and Asia as they can. Now, by the time that we get to the year 1800, the British are already at the forefront of global imperial domination. What I mean by that is this. The British, if you recall, going back to our unit on the French Revolution, had spent several years fighting against Napoleon, and by the time that we get to 1815, the British have successfully vanquished Napoleon. And by that point, they had already in the 1700s, if you'll remember going back to the Enlightenment unit, by the 1700s, the British had already defeated the French in the 7 Years' War, and they had been defeated in the American Revolution, but kind of bounced back after that with a number of victories against Napoleon in Europe during the French Revolution years. And so by the time that we get to 1815, the British are pretty much the unchecked global naval power. Navies were really, really important back in those days because they didn't have air technology yet. There was no planes or things like that. And so you needed a very strong and sizable navy to be able to go and administer colonies from across the globe. The British Empire had colonies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Australia, and they colonized more land than any other nation did. They took over 25% of the world, and they were the most powerful empire from 1800 all the way up until the start of World War I in 1914. All right, so the British Empire was very, very, very powerful. For over a century, really closer to a century and a half. The British are kind of the unchecked naval and imperial power on the globe and commanded the respect of a lot of other European nations during this time. Now, you might be wondering a simple question like, why didn't Britain go and try and imperialize places in Europe? Why didn't they go and imperialize places in Europe? The answer is quite simple, really. If you go and try and take over a place in Europe, like let's say Spain or Italy, the rest of the European countries are going to object to that, and you're going to have a war on your hands. The key to good colonization at this time was going to places that you knew you would have been able to militarily subdue relatively easily, because the global population at this time is not completely industrialized. There's a lot of places that are very, very far behind Britain in terms of industrialization, which means that as Britain continues to industrialize and become wealthier and other things, their technology and their military becomes stronger as a byproduct of that. So the British were going to places that they knew that they would be relatively successful in being able to set up those indirect kinds of government that aren't going to cause a lot of conflict. Remember that the British tried to use indirect rule as much as they could in their colonies across the globe. So as we look at the height of the British Empire, okay, the height of the British Empire, a couple of things to keep in mind about this map are that the 13 colonies had already, by the time that we get to the 1800s, the time period that we're in, the 13 colonies had already broken away, right? They had already established America. So these regions over here in the 13 colonies of North America, remember that in 1776 they broke away and they established themselves as the United States. But they still retained control over Canada. They still retain control in the Caribbean, what at the time was referred to as the West Indies. They retain control in a couple of places in Central America, even though most of these places were taken over by the Spanish. And they even retained a couple of places over here in in South America. You woke up at 6 today trying to finish the imperialism assignment. Now it's due at 10. Consider yourself lucky. All right. So, and then in Africa, take a look at the territories that they control in Africa. And there's a very geographical significance, piece of significance to this. First of all, they have some territories here on what was previously the, West Central Africa was the place where, most of the slaves were taken from these regions right in here, okay? The Senegambia region is what this is sometimes referred to. Senegambia is kind of in this region here. And then as you move down, you get into the Gold Coast region. There were a lot of slaves that were taken from those regions as well. And then, of course, Nigeria. And if you haven't been following the news the last couple of weeks, there's been some big news in Nigeria who have continually been facing the difficulties of the decolonization period. So we're in the colonization period right now in this class, but what you'll find out is as we move into the 1900s after the Second World War, we enter into a period known as decolonization, where these nations that had previously been colonies of European countries start breaking away from colonial rule and establishing their independence. And Nigeria has struggled in the last little bit here with the remnants of colonization and British domination in their culture and stuff like that. And there's been some protests in Nigeria recently. But the piece of most geographical significance are these regions right in here. If you know anything about Africa, you may know of the Nile River. The Nile River runs all the way from about right here where this arrow is, okay, all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea where Egypt is right here, okay? And so the Nile River, just as a little bit of a fact for you in case you didn't know this, the Nile River flows south to north, okay? It seems backwards to a lot of kids. A lot of kids think that the Nile River starts in Egypt and flows southwards. That is incorrect. The Nile River flows northwards and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And the reason that this is significant is because as the British were collecting goods in South Africa, okay, and places like Rhodesia, which gets named after Cecil Rhodes, okay, which is why they call it Rhodesia. All right, as they collect materials, which is the whole point of imperialism, is to go to these places and extract raw materials that you can't get elsewhere. They then pack those materials onto boats and ship those boats all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea up here along the Nile River, and then take the boats and transfer them over to Britain, okay? It essentially allows for a shortcut for Britain to be able to utilize the Nile River as a major source of transportation for the goods that they are extracting from these African colonies that they have indirectly taken over. Also, during this time, the French contribute to building right here. There's a thing right here known as the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula separates the Mediterranean Sea with a body of water down here called the Red Sea. The Red Sea looks like a giant slug. And the French had started building in the 1800s. They started the late 1800s. They started building what became known as the Suez Canal. Okay, the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal connects together the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, so that instead of sailing from Britain all the way down the coast of Africa, all the way around the southern tip of Africa, all the way over across the Indian Ocean to India, which was their most prized colony. The most important colony that the British had was India, by a long shot. by a long shot. It was the most important colony they had, okay? But what the Suez Canal enables them to do by being able to jump over the Sinai Peninsula here, rather sail through it using the canal, they were able to cut their sailing time in half. And the Suez Canal very much became nicknamed the lifeline of the empire, because what it did was it shortened the trip over to India by about half. So now the British just have to sail through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, down through the Red Sea, and then over to India over here, rather than having to go the long way all the way around through two different oceans. So this kind of gives you an idea of just how much land Britain controlled. Even they had territory in some regions in Antarctica, down in the southern ice cap, okay? And so the British control a substantial amount of territory. And the reason I want to bring this up again is because remember that saying of the British Empire. The British Empire, the empire upon which the sun never sets. Okay, meaning that at any given point across the globe, the sun was shining somewhere on a piece of land, a colony controlled by Britain. Okay. We also have to talk about the French Empire. The French Empire had its locations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And behind Britain, they are number 2 in terms of largest European empires in the world in the early to mid 1800s. Even though Napoleon had died, even though the French were behind in industrialization, they nonetheless controlled a significant amount of territory themselves at certain points in history. And they very much competed with Great Britain for colonial possessions. For example, if we go down here, you can see that some of the same regions that the British occupied in red over here, the French occupy in blue. And the reason that is because they occupied different small territories here, and they competed with one another for control over these territories. As you can see, the French at one point held several colonies in the West Indies, in South America. They hold vast regions of North Africa. So whereas the British were controlling these regions over here, remember the British control these regions, okay, all along the Nile River here, the French control much of what is now really what we call the Saharan Desert, right? Lots of North African regions in these areas here, places like Morocco, Algeria, and so on, Tunisia, etc. Okay, and you have these regions in here, very desert-like regions that were largely controlled by the French. No doubt not as valuable as the regions to the east over here that the British controlled, but nonetheless a lot of territory that the French administered. Also some territories in the Middle East. Madagascar was French controlled. India had places, remember that India was controlled by both the British and the French at one point. After the 7 Years' War, though, India is largely taken over by the British, and the French control over India diminishes significantly after the British defeat the French in several wars that they had against one another, and this reduces French influence in India and increases British influence in India. And then over here, you can see the areas of what at the time were known as Indochina, which is the region between India and China up here, which is now known as the regions of, say, Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, places like that. These places were at one time controlled by the French. And then, of course, the third largest empire still belonged to the Spanish, who we will remember were really the pioneers of the first age of colonialism, going back to Christopher Columbus back in the late 1400s and early 1500s. The Spanish Empire still controlled significant amounts of territories in the early 1800s. Now, as the 1800s go on, a lot of the territories that the Spanish Empire controlled started to break away from Spanish control as Spain became weaker and weaker and weaker throughout the ages. Nonetheless, the Spanish were most responsible for spreading the Spanish language to Central and South America, and spreading Catholicism to America, as well as the Spanish were very successful in converting indigenous populations to their faith of Catholicism. So as we look at the map for Spain, you can see that at one point the Spanish controlled all of these territories up here, including even the Louisiana territory, which eventually gets taken over by the French during the Napoleonic era. So these lands of the Louisiana Purchase territory eventually get taken over by the French. But the Spanish controlled much of these regions here, what are modern day California, Texas, as well as Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Mexico down here, Central America. The Spanish controlled much of Western South America as well as several colonies in the Caribbean too. And so this is really where the Spanish control was. But as I said, a lot of these territories begin to break away from Spanish rule in the 1800s. In the mid-1800s, the Americans fight a war against Mexico known as the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War resulted in the Mexicans being defeated by the American military and then giving over a lot of these regions of what is now the United States over to the United States in the Mexican Cession, is what it was called, as the territories seceded from Mexico and were annexed by the United States. So those, as I said, were the regions of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. All of those at one point belonged to Mexico, but they are essentially taken by the Americans, who had already begun colonizing in some of these regions in the mid-1800s as Americans began to move westward across the continent. All right. So let's talk about imperialism in Africa. Imperialism in Africa really gets started in the very tail end of the 1800s, the 1870s, 1880s. And the European nations had, if you remember, going back to the Napoleonic era, at the end of the Battle of Waterloo, which was Napoleon's final defeat. Okay, Napoleon is once and for all defeated, and he's sent all the way down to St. Helena, which is, I think, this tiny little dot on the map over here, if you can even see it. St. Helena is in the South Atlantic, and Napoleon is gone. After Napoleon is gone, Europeans held that conference that we learned about. It was called the it was called the Congress of Vienna, okay, the Congress of Vienna. And at the Congress of Vienna, if you'll remember, the whole point of the Congress of Vienna was to, create a balance of power in Europe and prevent more revolutions from breaking out. And the Congress of Vienna was rather successful in creating a long-lasting peace between European nations. Remember that European nations, for a long time, European nations had been warring against one another, okay? And they were tired of warring against one another. And as they move throughout the 1800s, there are some isolated conflicts dealing with revolutions breaking out in various places in Europe. We see revolutions in the year 1848, which is the first time that peace was broken in Europe after the Congress of Vienna, which had taken place in 1815 after Napoleon was vanquished. So from 1815 all the way up till 1848, Europe was relatively peaceful. As we move into the second half of the 1800s, okay, from 1850 to 1900, European nations returned back to trying to restore a balance of power between European nations to prevent conflict between them. And they hold several meetings to that end, to try to prevent conflict from breaking out. And one of the meetings that they held between European nations was known as the Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference was where European nations came together to agree on how to divide up Africa. We sometimes refer to this period of imperialism as the scramble for Africa, as European nations woke up one day in the late 1800s and said, let's go take over Africa. They met with one another to determine how to do this without going to war with one another, as they began to compete for places to take over in Africa. All right, so Great Britain and France already had an advantage going into the Berlin Conference because they already controlled certain regions of Africa. So those regions were going to remain under French and British control after this meeting concluded. Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal kind of received the leftovers. So, one of the ways that I often compare the Berlin Conference is, we're coming up on Thanksgiving here. Imagine the Berlin Conference basically being all of the members of your family, being the different European nations, coming together, and essentially two members of your family, they start deciding how are we going to carve the turkey on Thanksgiving and dish out everybody sitting at the table. All right, this is very much what the Europeans are doing at this time. They're coming together. If you picture Africa as being the Thanksgiving turkey, they're basically deciding what pieces of the turkey are different European nations going to receive on their plate. All right, and Britain and France received the most amount of Africa. Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal received the leftovers. A lot of the imperialism that took place in Africa was very, very heavily motivated by that idea of white man's burden, the idea that colonies are uncivilized places, okay, in the vast corners of the globe, and that Europeans viewed themselves very much with a paternalistic attitude. What paternalism is fatherliness, okay, fatherliness. When we talk about paternalism, okay, that prefix P-A-T-E-R, pater or pater, okay, is always referring to father, okay? So patriot, for example, okay, is another, or patriarch, or paternalism, or paternity test. All of those things refer to fathers, okay, of some sort. So paternalism is this sense that European nations very much viewed themselves as the fathers that needed to watch over the rest of the world as though they were children, as well as spread the civilization of Europe to as many places as they could. And that goes back to those social motivations, that we talked about with your assignment for today. The motivations of them to go and spread European culture to these other places, and the whole idea of social Darwinism and the idea of white man's burden. All of that is wrapped up in this feeling of paternalism that a lot of Europeans had of themselves, thinking that they were the fathers of the rest of the globe, and the rest of the place were like kids that needed to be trained how to be like their fathers, okay, by being told all of, how to develop, basically. So here's a drawing of the Berlin Conference. You can see here a giant map of Africa in the background as white male Europeans come together to decide how are the various European nations going to carve up Africa without going to war with one another. And this is a drawing. Now, this is held in Berlin. Berlin is in Germany, which at the time had only just become an independent nation. Germany had previously been a fragmented collection of German-speaking, German culture states that were not actually unified into a single territory until 1871. And the guy that was responsible for unifying Germany was this guy right here, who's featured most prominently in the image. Your eyes are kind of drawn to him. His name is Otto von Bismarck, and Otto von Bismarck was a brilliant politician who basically mastered the game of European international chess. All right, and when I say that, I don't literally mean playing chess. I mean political dynamics. He played Europe like it was a chess game, and he was very, very, very brilliant as a politician. And he was the one responsible for unifying Germany in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, which the Prussians defeated France. And here is a photograph of the, and it's not a very high quality photo obviously, but here's a photograph of the various European powers coming together at the Berlin Conference and agreeing with one another over how to divide up Africa. Here's kind of a, this is actually not from the Berlin Conference, but this is kind of what's going on during this time. This is a political cartoon that actually was released during the age of Napoleon. This is before Napoleon was vanquished, all right? But basically what we see here is very similar in spirit to what's happening in the age of the scramble for Africa, where European nations are carving up Africa like a Thanksgiving turkey. Here you can see Napoleon carving up Europe and dishing himself a piece of Europe. And you can see the Duke of Wellington on the left side, which was the British commander, and he's carving up his own pieces of the globe. And if we were to, redo this political cartoon in the late 1800s, this is from the early 1800s, while Napoleon was still around, but if we were to redo this political cartoon in the late 1800s, it may look a little bit more like this, where you have a whole bunch of European and imperial powers, including even the Japanese, who were considered an imperial power by the late 1800s. And you can see America here, and who is that over on that side? I'm not really sure who that is on that side. I'd have to look that up. The British guy is standing there observing the game, and then you see the German guy and the Russian guy and so on in the background observing this game. And it's almost like a poker game where they're betting on different colonies, and you can see all the European nations coming together and observing this this gambling game that they're playing with different colonies. Here you can, this next slide here deals with the two places in Africa that managed to resist Europe taking them over. Essentially, the entire continent of Africa gets taken over by Europe, except for these two places. Okay, so the two places that remain free from European takeover in the entire continent of Africa are Liberia and Ethiopia. Now, Liberia has a twisted story. Basically, Liberia gets founded actually by the United States, but they're not establishing it necessarily as a colony per se, the way that the European nations were doing. Liberia actually had to do with the issue of slavery going on in America during the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, what we call the antebellum period, the period of American history that takes place before the Civil War breaks out in 1861. And so as we look at the case of Liberia, what happened was in America, as gradual emancipation had resulted in an increase in the free black population in the North, just because they had begun to put an end to slavery in the North didn't mean that free blacks were necessarily treated as equal citizens. In fact, quite the opposite. As slavery dies out in the North, racism is on the rise in the North. And so there were a lot of free black populations that as the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s progress, they see their rights systematically taken away from them. The vote is taken away from free blacks in the North. They are no longer allowed to vote and other things like that. All right, and so basically there was a movement that started in America. And the movement that started in America was this idea of, because the free black population was not treated as welcome in America, there were a number of both whites and blacks in America that began to advocate for, essentially relocating to West Africa, where they had descended from. And so, because the slaves had been brought over from Africa. Now, keep in mind, of course, the people that we're talking about who supported the idea of the free black population of America moving to Africa, for the most part, those people were American, right? They spoke English. They had been living in America for generations by this point. And so it's not that they're really going, quote unquote, back to Africa, because they weren't from Africa anymore. These people were from America now. But nonetheless, because of how badly they were being treated in America, we started to see a movement that became popular in the antebellum period of relocating to Africa to set up an independent colony of free black populations and even freed slave populations of African Americans. All right, so that's how Liberia gets founded. Here's the problem with it, though, is that when Liberia gets founded by the American Colonization Society, which was this organization that advocated for blacks, relocating to Africa, when it was founded, the first group of Africans that they sent over there were a very recently, it should be open. I don't know what to tell you, Arnav. It should be open. I guarantee you I changed it. So anyhow, so moving forward here, home for freed slaves in the United States. I got to keep talking about this, otherwise I'm going to run out of time here. Liberia ends up turning into a mess, and here's why. The population of blacks that they sent over from America to settle in Liberia were recently freed slaves. And the reason that that's problematic is because as recently freed slaves, the only thing that they knew was slavery. All right, that was the only thing that they had any experience with. And so as this free black population that had lived in slavery relocates to Liberia, the first thing they do is promptly enslave the Liberian population there. And this creates a huge nightmare for Liberia, which to this day, Liberia is a mess. It's one of the poorest nations on the planet. There are tremendous problems in Liberia with cannibalistic warlords, childhood drug use, human trafficking, sex trafficking. Liberia is really a very downtrodden and troubled nation. Extremely corrupt, extremely poverty-stricken, and it's rooted in this, failed idea of recolonizing African Americans over to Africa, and how the whole history plays out there. Arnav, I'm just going to take care of this so that you can see. Okay, here, imperialism, motivation assignment, or motives assignment, edit. Okay, as we go down here. Due November 10th at 10 p.m., open until November 10th at 10 p.m. It is open, so I don't know what to tell you. You can either submit a file or you can submit a link. Okay, I have it set up right here. File uploads, Okay, and website uploads. You can do it. It's all ready to go. Okay, so I promise you it is set up. Now, moving on here, the other place that is successful in resisting European takeover has a less tragic history, and that is Ethiopia. Ethiopia remained free the entire time, and that's in part thanks to the leader of Ethiopia. His name was Menelik II. Menelik II was an Ethiopian emperor in 1889 who successfully played the various European colonizers against each other. Well, I don't know how to fix it, Arnav. Find a solution. Italians tried to claim Ethiopia. Italians tried to claim Ethiopia, but the Ethiopians defeated them in the Battle of Adowa of 1896. So it's one of the few times, Ethiopia is one of the few times where we see an African nation actually successfully defend itself against a European empire, the Italians, who were trying to take them over. And so Ethiopia remained free throughout the entire era of African colonization during this time. So as we look at this map of Africa in terms of, by the time that we get to the late 1800s, who controls what in Africa? Who controls what? Well, here is a colorized map for you. Here's a colorized map for you that shows you, the territories in blue are the ones that were controlled by France. The territories in pink were the ones controlled by Great Britain. That giant yellow place, which became known as the Belgian Congo, was controlled by Belgium. Spain had a couple of tiny holdings. Italy had some holdings in what is now like modern day Somalia and places like that. All right, and then Germany had some holdings in what is now places like Cameroon and Togo up here. All right, and then Portugal had a couple of places as well. But there were these gray regions here. This is the region of Ethiopia defended successfully by Menelik II, and who beat the Italians in the Battle of Adowa in 1896. And then this is the region of Africa that called Liberia, that still exists today. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, which is named after President James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States. And so anyhow, these are the only two regions that remain technically independent. The rest of Africa, the entire continent you can see here, gets taken over by European powers. Talking a little bit more about Belgium. The king of Belgium at this time was a guy known as Belgian King Leopold II. Belgian King Leopold II was a pretty cruel guy. And Leopold II's, efforts in the Congo resulted in a lot of Congolese native Africans being killed. And when I say a lot, I mean 10 million Congolese died due to his cruelty and abusive rule. King Leopold II colonized that region of Africa known as the Congo, and that's the region right there, okay, in red. He hired a British explorer by the name of Henry Stanley to set up the Belgian settlements there, but King Leopold II basically treated the Congo as his own personal land, okay, and he was very heavily motivated by greed. The kinds of things they were taking from the Congo were like rare plants, rubber. Rubber, I don't know if you know, but rubber has to be extracted from rubber trees, okay, and other things like that. And so the region of the Congo was very resource rich, and the King Leopold II, was using all of these riches to his own personal gain for the first part of Belgian colonization of the Congo. And we have to keep in mind that that is itself shows you the difference between how powerful these European nations are comparative to these African territories that they're taking over, because Belgium is tiny, 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 tiny little Belgium. The Congo as a colony is 80 times larger than Belgium itself. And nonetheless, they are still able to effectively, completely take it over because they're so far more developed with industrialization by the late 1800s that the Congolese have very little that they can utilize to defend themselves against the Belgians. And here you can see a photograph of soldiers in the Belgian Congo as they explore and begin to set up their colony in the Congo. Okay, the French. We talked about before last class, or last Thursday, we talked about how the French were much more inclined to use direct rule, where the French would go into a place and directly rule them by overthrowing the local rulers, the local populations were subdued, and the entire government was then made into a French government run by French administrators. And again, that's very different from how the British, by and large, did things, which was through indirect rule, where they tried to work with local leaders and not directly take over the colonies that they were subduing. And so the French used direct rule. They assimilated Africans into French culture. They allowed Africans to run for office and serve in the French National Assembly after they had already taken over the entire government, which was controlled by the French government. And the colonies that the French had in Africa, West Africa, were Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So here you can see an image of the Kingdom of Morocco, which was actually divided halfway between French rule in the north and then Spanish rule in the south. And so Morocco was heavily influenced by both the French and the Spanish, probably more so the French though. Here you can see some photographs of some of these places in Africa that I just thought I would include some photos here. Dude, Arnav, man, I don't know what to tell you, man. I'm trying to do the best I can for you, but I'm in the middle of a lecture here and you keep interrupting me, and it's frankly annoying me now. So I don't know what to tell you, man. You know, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to submit it in Canvas. It makes no sense that you wouldn't be able to. It's open until 10 p.m. It's right here. You can upload files or a website URL. Here, do this. Put it onto your Google Drive, okay? This is a very easy solution. Put it onto your Google Drive, make it a shareable link, and then submit the link. It's not that difficult, man. You've been doing this all semester. All right, let's move on. I'm trying to finish this lecture here so I can move on with my day. All right. All right, so the fortified city in Morocco. Here you can see the influence of the vocab's late, dude. The vocab is late. The vocab closed last Thursday or something. All right, so here's now as you take a look at this here. All right, as you take a look at this here, this is Casablanca, Morocco. But as you look at the architecture here, you could very easily look at this and confuse it for a place in France, because the place in France here, okay, the place in France here, right? God, I'm gonna have to close this. I'm not even gonna read the comments anymore, Arnav, because I keep on getting distracted by your comments. All right, so as we look at this place here, this place looks like it could be in France. Why does it look like it's in France, even though it's obviously not in France? It's in Morocco. Because when the French took places over, due to direct rule, all right, due to direct rule, the French started implementing how they did things in Africa. They started building stuff that looked like French architecture. And this street is literally named Boulevard de Paris, okay, which is obviously a reference to the capital of France, Boulevard de Paris, all right? And this is in Casablanca, Morocco. But it would be very easy to look at this and say, wow, this looks super, super French in terms of its design. And that's because when the French went and took over these places, they began building those places to look more French. All right, here is Algeria, all right, massive country in North Africa. And you can see here, again, a lot of architectural designs that are reminiscent of a major city in southern France, okay? Even though they are in North Africa, they have a tendency to look very similar to the kinds of regions that you would see in southern France. And then like the architecture in Algiers, once again, you can see the influence of French architecture as the French took over Algeria and began building it in the image of France. All right? Talking again a little bit more about Great Britain, remember that they used more often indirect rule. Now, with indirect rule, British authorities are still making all the decisions, but they are just operating as advisors to the native authorities who retained their power and influence locally. So the native authorities would make a deal with the British and then enforce all of the decisions that the British told them to do. And in Africa, in most places in Africa, the British actually kept the old African elites in power. And this ended up resulting in class and tribal warfare after these African nations start breaking away from British control after World War II in the mid-20th century. The African elites who had cooperated with the British find themselves in conflict with their own people who had really suffered under British colonialism in Africa. And so, the British essentially, after the age of imperialism comes to a complete close at the end of World War II, and these nations start exerting self-determination and independence, it creates conflicts as the British leave, and a power vacuum is left behind where the British once would have been able to assert control and use their military. Now these African nations who are striving for independence are going to be fighting with one another in the wake of Britain leaving Africa. So the major colonies that Britain utilized in Africa were Egypt. Again, as I mentioned, the French had built the Suez Canal and the English took it over. And the Suez Canal was very much considered the lifeline of the empire because it provided the British with a strategic shipping route to its colonies over in Asia, particularly India. And also the Sudan was another region that Britain controlled. There were a lot of conflicts in the area of what is now modern-day Sudan between the British and the French, as the French were trying to take Sudan and the British were trying to use Sudan to protect their interests in Egypt. And so the British and the French fight over the region of Sudan for a long time, and it results in the British successfully taking the region of Sudan for themselves. And then South Africa was another major region that the British utilized. And originally South Africa was actually colonized by the Dutch. And the story about that is basically that the Dutch, before the British had gone to South Africa, the Dutch had already sent a number of Dutch farmers known as Boers, B-O-E-R-S, Boers. Okay, they had sent the Boers, the Dutch had sent the Boers down to South Africa, and they began living there. And South Africa was a very, important place to colonize for Europeans because its climate, in terms of all of the regions of Africa, Africa is a huge, huge, huge continent. And there are a lot of different climates, from deserts to jungles to savannas to, coastal regions and so on. There's a lot of different climates in Africa. But South Africa, in terms of climates, is the most temperate region of all of Africa, and it's at the very, very southern part of Africa. And the Dutch had gone and settled in South Africa in part because in terms of farming, you could grow all of the same things in South Africa that you could in the Netherlands, where the Dutch lived. And because of that, all right, they were very lucky because, just by way of chance, when they went down to South Africa, they realized it was a very similar climate, and they didn't have to change too much about their farming techniques to be able to survive in South Africa. However, the British arrive in South Africa and they immediately begin coming into conflict with the Dutch folks who had already started settling in those areas. And so the British end up going to war with the Boers twice. There was the first Boer War and there was the second Boer War. And ultimately, after the Second Boer War, the Dutch are pushed off of the lands further north, which causes the Dutch to come into conflict with other African tribal communities that they had not yet come into conflict with. And so the Dutch get systematically pushed off of the lands in South Africa as the British make their way there and start taking over more and more and more of it. So South Africa, originally held by the Dutch Boers, but after going to war with the British, the Boers get pushed off of that land, and increasingly the British take over. And the kind of government that gets set up by the British in South Africa is very, very, very strict, and it results in the black populations of South Africa, which made up something like 98% of the population of South Africa, was of course black. Okay, but in South Africa, the British only allowed white folks to vote in elections in South Africa, which means that only 2% of the population was able to participate in government and hold office. And this system that gets created in South Africa becomes known as apartheid. Apartheid is a system where in South Africa, basically the whites, who make up only 2% of the English descendants who colonized South Africa, have all of the political power, and 98% of the population of black South Africans whose land they took are not able to participate in government. And by the way, we did not see a black president of South Africa until I was in 4th grade, when Nelson Mandela was elected president as the first black president of South Africa, and he ended the system of apartheid there. All right, here you can see Egypt. Of course, Egypt has a lot of things that you've seen before, like the pyramids of Giza. All right. This is the Nile River, which was a major shipping route utilized by the British. And then here is the city of Cairo. Cairo is the capital of Egypt. And you can see here again the influence of the British, who began constructing buildings using architectural designs that the British used. And Cairo grows significantly under British domination throughout the late 1800s and into the start of the 1900s, and it has continued to develop ever since then as Egypt gained its independence from Britain. But again, as we go to the street level, you can see that there is a lot of European influence in the architectural designs of the city of Cairo, remnants of the age of colonization from the late early 1900s. And then too, you can also sometimes, you can still sometimes see kind of the North African, Middle Eastern influence there with some of the structures as well. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, down towards the south, so here on this map, you can see now this is where we're looking at. Egypt is all the way up here in North Africa. But in South Africa, down here, This is the regions that down here in this region that the Boers had started to settle in. And as the British come over and start taking over regions of South Africa, they push the Boers over to different regions further to the east and further to the north, where there were other African peoples living in these communities that started to come into conflict with the European powers, the Dutch and the British. In particular, the Zulu tribe was a very notable tribe that resisted European encroachment into their territories. Here you can see this little thing right here, this little horn, okay, that kind of juts off the end right here. This is this right here. This is Cape Town, South Africa. And you can see that there's a nice natural bay here that the British used for transporting goods, shipping, and stuff like that. And here you can see some Cape Town architecture, again heavily influenced by European architecture. Very beautiful region, very fertile land here that was suitable for European growing methods. And here you can see the remnants of Dutch architecture. This is a very Dutch looking design here of a building in South Africa that was probably built somewhere around the turn of the 20th century. And again, just the heavy influence of European methods of industrialization and urbanization are still able to be seen. Here you can see a photograph snapped in 1940 in Cape Town, South Africa, where there's a lot of European influence there. And here's what Cape Town looks like today. They do drive on the left-hand side of the road because the British drive on the left-hand side of the road, and because the British controlled South Africa, when cars came around, they implemented traffic systems that mirrored the British traffic systems. And again, another piece of influence going back to British colonization of South Africa. All right, folks, so let me pull this back up here now. So, all right, here we go. What is going on here? Dude, Arno, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, let's see here. So, are you sure you're clicking on the right assignment? That's the only thing that I can think is the problem here. If you click on world history, okay, you click on world history, you go down here to imperialism, motivation, assignment, okay, this one, all right, imperial motives assignment. And then you simply submit your assignment. The vocab one has been open since, last week. The vocab one closed today, but that one was already open. So it has been up since Thursday. Dude, Arnav, I don't know, maybe, it's easy. I don't know. It has been, man. Why would I lie to you? Why would I lie to you? It's been open since Thursday. I'll tell you what, Arnav, for late credit, okay? For late credit, you can submit the assignment on, you can send it to me in a message in Canvas, and I'll give you late credit for it. That's the best I'm willing to do. So, all right. So folks, let's go ahead and call an end to class here today. I covered a lot of content, okay? I covered a whole lot of content. I hope that you were listening carefully and not overly distracted, because Arnav, I get the feeling that you probably really weren't listening to anything that I said. And so you may want to rewatch this lecture, man, because there's some very important stuff that I talked about in today's lecture, but I don't want to overload you with information in any one given class time. But there's a lot of stuff I talked about. And yes, you will have homework. I'll be putting up the homework assignment in just a few minutes here. The homework assignment will be due for Thursday at 8 a.m. Okay, Thursday at 8 a.m. is when the homework assignment will be due. All right, folks, and so that is the end of class for today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of the day.